We're here to idea everyone, to fire up your curiosity and connect you with the people and ideas that shape our world. Watch, listen, understand, connect, create. Let's move the human story forward together.
Hello and welcome to The Poetry of Science, a podcast which provides insight into new scientific research via the medium of poetry. I'm your host, Dr. Sam Illingworth. I'll be introducing you to some of the latest scientific findings and sharing a selection of science-themed poetry. We could all do with a little bit more poetry in our lives. In this episode, I'll be exploring new research which has found that violence is broadly felt by millions of Californians. Thank you for taking the time to reflect on the proximities to violence in your life and social networks. You said you personally know X people who might physically hurt another person. How many of these hurts involved a gun? And when did they erode your sense of community? You said you personally knew Y people who have been shot by someone else. How many of these peoples were shot on purpose? And when does Y become a number too loud to count? You said you personally know Z people who own a gun. How many of these guns have shot their hurt at other people? And at what point does living in your neighbourhood resemble living in a cemetery? This poem is inspired by recent research published in Injury Epidemiology, which has found that violence impacts most Californians, at least indirectly. Fueled by gun violence, cities across the United States are breaking all-time homicide records. According to the 2020 Uniform Crime Report from the FBI, homicides rose 30% from 2019 to 2020, the largest single-year increase the agency has recorded since it began tracking these crimes in the 1960s. Previous studies of exposure to violence have tended to focus on events such as direct or witnessed abuse, and there is much evidence to suggest that these exposures can have long-lasting adverse effects on all parties in their extended networks and communities, particularly when firearms are involved. In this new study, researchers decided to focus on a broader range of experiences of violence in daily life, for example hearing gunshots, encountering a sidewalk memorial to a violent death, or learning about a violent event through a friend or family member. The researchers surveyed 2,870 adults from across California, asking them questions that related to their own experiences of violence, and in total 65% of the participants reported one or more such experience, with 11% reporting 3 or more. Other trends included knowledge of people who had shot themselves being greatest amongst respondents aged 60 years or older, and the knowledge of persons being at risk of violence to themselves being greatest amongst people aged 18 to 29 years. Ultimately, this research shows that in California the majority of people have at least one experience of violence, and given that this is a state with relatively low rates of firearm violence, this situation is likely to be much worse in other regions across the United States. Now that you've heard the science, let me read the poem to you again. Thank you for taking the time to reflect on the proximities to violence in your life and social networks. You said you personally know X people who might physically hurt another person. How many of these hurts involved a gun? And when did they erode your sense of community? You said you personally know Y people who have been shot by someone else. How many of these peoples were shot on purpose? And when does Y become a number too loud to count? You said you personally know Z people who own a gun. How many of these guns have shot their hurt at other people? And at what point does living in your neighbourhood resemble living in a cemetery? In this section of the podcast, I'd like to share a poem written by another poet on a topic related to the science that has been discussed so far. In this episode, I'll be reading Parable in Praise of Violence by Tony Barnstone. Tony Barnstone is a poet, translator, editor and fiction writer who was born in Middletown, Connecticut in the United States in 1961 and raised in Indiana, Vermont and Spain. He was educated at Wesleyan University, the University of California, Santa Cruz and the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned a PhD. Barnstone's poetry collections include Naked Magic, published in 2002, Tongue of War, published in 2009, and Pulp Sonnets, published in 2015. His honours include fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the California Arts Council, as well as a Pushcart Prize, the Palmanock Poetry Award, and the Randall Jarrell Poetry Prize. Barnstone is currently a Professor of English Language and Literature at Whittier College in Los Angeles. Parable in Praise of Violence by Tony Barnstone. Thanks for the violence. Thanks for Walt's rude muscle pushing through the grass, for tiny Gulliver crushed between the giant's breasts. Thanks for Moby's triangular hump and Ahab's castrated leg. Thanks for the harpoons. Thanks for this PBS history of the automatic pistol. The good machine is simple, few moving parts, an efficiency of what's preserved and what is wasted. So with each shot the recoil cocks the gun to shoot again, then recoil cock and shoot again, recoil cock, and so on till the target buys it, or your ammo's spent. Thanks for the poem, which is really a little pistol, load and cock, point and aim, then the trigger, the hammer, the powder, the discharge, the bullet, the target, the recoil, the crime. No smoking gun, just ballistics, caliber, powder marks. The question why? My life is like a loaded gun, and when I aim it at you, I hope to take off the top of your head. No safety on, no playing nice, just the spark, the flash, the damage, just red American cherry pie violence. So thank you for the harpoon gun we aim at God and death and all the unknown world, and for the spear-stuck beast, rope ripping through torn hands, for what refuses to be caught and what we fathom only by riding the whale down into the deep, refusing to let go. Thank you for listening to the Poetry of Science. If you want to find out more about the scientific study featured in this episode, or read any of the poems in full, then please visit the show notes at scipoetry.podbean.com. That's scipoetry.podbean.com, where you can also find out how to get in touch with any questions or comments you might have. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for being with us for this episode of the ideaXme Show. ideaXme is a global platform. Our mission is to move the human story forward by sharing knowledge of the future. You can find us on all major audio networks at www.radioideaXme.com, on YouTube and Vimeo. Please subscribe.